I can remember a few times when I've been so happy that I've scarcely known what to do. One time when I was little and got a sled as a Christmas present from Jonathan, one that he had saved up to buy for a long time, and then the time when I first came to Nangiala and found Jonathan down by the stream, and the whole first tremendous evening at Knight's Farm. I was so joyful, happy then, but nothing else was like finding Jonathan on Mattis's floor. I never thought I could be so happy. It felt like a hearty laugh within my soul, because I was so happy now. I didn't touch Jonathan, I didn't wake him, I didn't yell or feel jubilant. I just laid down next to him very quietly and fell asleep. How long was I asleep? I don't know. The whole day, I believe. But when I awoke, yes, when I awoke, Jonathan was sitting there on the floor beside me. He just sat there and smiled. No one could look as kind as Jonathan when he smiles. I thought that he might not be happy that I'd come, that he might have already forgotten how he had called for help, but now I could see. That he was as glad as I was, so I had to smile with him, and we sat there just looking at each other, saying nothing for a while. "You cried for help," I said at last. Then he stopped smiling. "Why did you call?" I asked. It was clearly something that he couldn't think about without getting upset. It was as if he hardly wanted to answer. He replied so quietly, "I saw Katla," he said. "I saw what Katla does." I didn't want to bother him with any questions about Katla, since I had so much to tell him, first and foremost about Jossie. Jonathan couldn't hardly believe it. His face turned white, he almost cried. "Jossie, no, not Jossie," he said, getting tears in his eyes. But then he got up. "Sophia must find out immediately." "How will you do that?" I wondered. "One of her doves is here," he said. "Bianca, she'll fly back tonight." Sophia's doves. Well, I couldn't believe it. I told Jonathan it was because of this dove that I was with him now and not in Kotla Cavern. "It's probably a miracle," I said, "that among all the houses in Wild Rose Valley, that I came right to the one where you were. But if Bianca hadn't been sitting outside, then I would have ridden past." Bianca, thank you for sitting there," said Jonathan, but he didn't have time to listen to me any longer. Now he was in a hurry. He scratched his nails on the shutter. It sounded just like a little rat scratching, but it wasn't long before the door opened and Matthias peeked in. "And little Scotty, he just sleeps and sleeps," began Matthias. But Jonathan didn't let him continue. "Fetch Bianca, if you'll be so kind," he said. "She must leave as soon as it starts to become dark." He explained why. He talked with Matthias about Jossie, and Matthias shook his head as old people do when they are sad. "Jossie, yes, I knew it must be someone from Cherry Valley," he said. "That's why Orvar is in Kotla Cavern." My God, there are such people. Then he disappeared to get Bianca, and he closed the shutter to us. It was a good hiding place Jonathan had here with Matthias, a little wooden room without windows or doors. The only way to go in and out was through the shutter behind the sideboard. No furniture was in it, just a cushion to sleep on, and a lamp that didn't light up the darkness much inside there. In the light from the lamp, Jonathan wrote a message to Sophia. "The traitor, cursed forever, his name is Jossie, the golden cockerel. Get him quickly, my brother is here now." "That's why Bianca flew here last night," said Jonathan, "to tell us that you had disappeared and were out looking for me." Just think then, Sophia understood the riddle. "I wrote on the kitchen wall," I said. "When she came with the soup, What riddle?" said Jonathan. "I'm searching for him far, far away beyond the mountains." I told him what I had written. It was so Sophia wouldn't be worried, I said. Then Jonathan laughed. "Not worried, yes, that's what you would think. And me, how calm do you think I felt when I found out you were somewhere up in Nangiala's mountains?" I must have looked ashamed, because he hurried to comfort me. "Brave little Scotty, it was both lucky and fortunate that you were there, and even more lucky and fortunate that you are here now." That was the first time anyone had called me brave, and I thought that if this kept up, then maybe I could be called Lionheart without Jossie ruining it. But then I remembered more that I had written on the wall at home, about one with a red beard who wanted white horses, and I asked Jonathan to add a line to the message. It was wrong what Carl said about red beard. I also told him how Hubbard had saved me from the wolves, and Jonathan said that he would be thankful to him for his whole life. Twilight was falling over Wild Rose Valley, and we released Bianca, and lights began shining everywhere, in the houses and farms on the hillside below us. It looked so calm and peaceful, and you could believe that people were sitting there now and eating their tasty evening meal, or maybe they just talked with each other, and played with their children and sang little tunes to them, and things were fine and life was enjoyable, but you knew that it wasn't so. You knew that they hardly had anything to eat, and that they weren't peaceful and happy at all, only unhappy. Tinjil's men up on the wall with their swords and spears helped you remember how it was, in case you had forgotten. A light did not burn in Mattias's window. His house was dark and everything was quiet, as if there weren't a single living soul in it. But we were there, not inside the house but outside. Mattias stood watch by the corner of the house, and Jonathan and I crept among the wild rose bushes with Bianca. These bushes were all around on the Mattias farm, and wild roses are something that I like, because they smell so good. Not strong at all, just faintly, but I thought to myself that I would probably never again smell the fragrance of wild roses without my heart pounding, and remembering how we crept among the wild rose bushes. Jonathan and I, so close to the wall where Tinjil's men were listening and searching, perhaps most of all for one with the name of Lionheart. Jonathan had darkened his face a little and pulled a hood down over his eyes. He didn't look like Jonathan, he didn't, but it was still risky, and it could be a matter of life or death every time he left his hiding place in the secret room. He called it a hideout. 100 men were searching for him day and night, which I knew, and I had talked with him about it, but he just said, yes, they'll probably carry on with the search. He had to release Bianca himself, he said, because he wanted to be sure that no one saw her as she flew away. The guards along the wall each had their own section of the wall to patrol. A big one paced up and down the whole time on top of the wall behind Mattis's farm. We would have to be careful of him most of all, but Mattias stood by the corner with a lantern, and he worked out how he would signal us. That is what he said. When I hold the lantern down low, then don't draw a single breath, because the big Dodic is quite close. But when I hold the lantern high, then he is far away where the wall curves, and he usually talks with one of Tinjil's men there. Then you'll be able to release Bianca. And we did. Fly, fly, said Jonathan. Fly my Bianca across Nangiala's mountains to Cherry Valley, and watch out for Jossie's arrows. I don't really know if Sophia's doves understood speech, but I almost believe that Bianca did, because she laid her beak next to Jonathan's cheek as if she wanted to calm him, and then she flew off. She gleamed so white in the twilight, so dangerously white. How easily big Dodic could have seen her as she flew over the wall. but he didn't. He probably stood there talking, and neither hearing nor seeing. Marius kept watch, and he didn't lower the lantern. We saw Bianca disappear, and I pulled at Jonathan. Now I wanted him to go back to the hideout quickly, but Jonathan didn't want to, not yet. It was such a wonderful evening. The air was cool and so pleasant to breathe. He probably didn't feel like crawling into a stuffy little room. No one could understand this better than I, who had been confined so long to lying on my kitchen sofa back at home in town. Jonathan was sitting in the grass with his arms around his knees and looking down at the valley quite calmly. You could almost believe he was thinking about sitting there the whole evening, despite all of Tinjil's men who were walking along the wall behind him. "Why are you sitting there?" I asked. "Because I like it," said Jonathan. "Because I like this valley at dusk, and the cool air on my face. I like it too, and pink roses that smell of summer." "I do too," I said, "and I like the flowers and grass and trees and meadows and forest and pretty little lakes," said Jonathan. "And when the sun comes up, and when the sun goes down, and when the moon shines and the stars glisten, and a few more things I can't remember right now. I like them too," I said. "Everyone likes them," said Jonathan, "and if they don't ask for anything more, can you tell me then why they can't have peace and quiet without someone like Tinjil coming along and destroying everything?" I couldn't answer, and then Jonathan said, "Come, it's best we go in." But we couldn't run right back in. First we had to know what was happening with Marius and where Big Doddick was. It had darkened. We couldn't see Marius any longer, only the light from the lantern. "He's holding it high. No Doddick there," said Jonathan. "Come now." But just as we began running, the light from the lantern dropped as quick as lightning, and we stopped. We heard galloping horses nearby, and then they slowed down, and someone talked to Marius. Jonathan gave me a little nudge in the back. "Go," he whispered, "go to Marius." He threw himself right into a wild rose bush, and I walked, scared and trembling, toward the lantern's light. "I wanted to get a little air," I heard Marius say. "It's such nice weather this evening." "Nice weather," replied a gruff voice. "There's a death penalty for being out after sundown. Didn't you know that?" "A disobedient old grandfather, that's what you are," said another. "Where is your boy, by the way?" "Here he comes," said Marius, because I was getting close to him now, and I recognized the two on horseback. They were Vetter and Cater. "Aren't you going up in the mountains to look at the moonlight tonight?" said Vetter. "What was your name, you little scamp? I never heard it." "I'm just called Scotty," I said. I risked saying it because no one else knew the name. Not Jossie or any one, only Jonathan and Marius and me. "Scotty, really," said Cater. "Listen, Scotty, why do you think we've come here?" Then it felt like my legs would buckle under me. To put me into a cavern, I thought. Naturally, they regretted letting me go, and now they were coming to get me. What else could I believe? "Well, you'll see," said Cater. "We ride around here in the valley during the evening to see that folks obey Tinjil's orders. But your grandfather has a hard time understanding. Maybe you can explain to him how bad it will be for both of you and him if you don't stay inside after it becomes dark. And don't forget," said Vetter, "one more time and you won't escape if we find you where you shouldn't be. Remember that, Scotty. If your grandfather lives or dies, it makes no difference. But you're so young, you want to grow up and become one of Tinjil's men, right?" Tinjil's man? No, I'd rather die, I thought, but I didn't say it. I was heartbroken over Jonathan, and I couldn't risk irritating them, so I answered meekly, "Yes, of course I want to." "Fine," said Vetter, "then you can come down to the big pier tomorrow morning, so you'll be able to see Tinjil, Wild Rose Valley's liberator. In the morning he's crossing the river of the ancient rivers in his golden sloop and coming ashore at the big pier." Then they were ready to be off, but Cater reined in his horse at the last second. "Listen, old man," he shouted to Marius, who was already halfway into the house. "You haven't seen a handsome, light-haired young called Lionheart, have you?" I held Marius by the hand, and I felt him shaking, but he answered calmly, "I know no Lionheart." "Really you don't," said Cater, "but if you were to accidentally chance upon meeting him, do you know what becomes of those who protect and hide him? The death penalty, you know that, right?" Then Marius shut the door behind us. "The death penalty here and the death penalty there," he said. "That's all those people think about." The sound of horses' hooves had scarcely died away before Marius was out with the lantern again, and soon Jonathan arrived, battered and scratched by the thorns on his hands and face, but happy because nothing bad had happened, and because Bianca was now in flight over the mountains. We ate our evening meal later, there in the kitchen with Marius, but with the shutter open so that Jonathan could quickly disappear into his hideout if someone came. But first we went out to the barn, Jonathan and I, and fed our horses. It was wonderful to see them together again. They stood with their heads so close to each other. I believe they were, in some way, telling each other everything that had happened to them. I gave them oats, both of them. Jonathan wanted to stop me at first, but then he said, "Yes, let them have it for once, but oats you don't give them to horses any longer here in Wild Rose Valley." When we went into the kitchen, Marius had placed a bowl of soup on the table. "We have nothing else, and it's mostly water," he said, "but at least it's warm." I looked around for my knapsack. I remembered what I had inside it, and when I pulled out all of my loaves of bread and my mutton, they gasped, both Jonathan and Marius, and their eyes began to shine. It felt so nice to lay out what was almost a feast to them. I cut up large slices of mutton, and we ate soup and bread and mutton. We ate and we ate. No one said anything, not for a long time, but at last Jonathan said, "Oh, to have enough." I had almost forgotten how it felt to be full. I became more and more pleased that I had come to Wild Rose Valley. It felt more and more right and good, and now I wanted to properly relate everything that had happened to me, from when I left home until Vetter and Cater helped me into Wild Rose Valley. Much of it I had already talked about, but Jonathan wanted to hear it many times, especially about Vetter and Cater. He laughed at that exactly like I thought he would, and Marius too. "They're not the most cunning Tinjil's men," said Marius, "although they think they are. Not even I could trick them," I said. "Think if they had known. The little brother they wanted so badly to catch was the one they just helped into Wild Rose Valley, and let go just like that." When I said it, I began to wonder. I hadn't thought of it before, but now I asked, "How in the world did you get into Wild Rose Valley, Jonathan?" Jonathan laughed some more. "I jumped in," he said. "How did you jump? Not with Grim?" I said, "Yes," said Jonathan. "I don't have another horse." I had seen them, and I knew how well Jonathan could jump with Grim, but to fly over the wall around Wild Rose Valley, that was more than a person could believe. "You see, the wall wasn't quite finished then," said Jonathan. "Not everywhere, not to its full height, though it was high enough. You could be sure of that." "Yes, but the guards," I said, "didn't you see them? Didn't they see you?" Jonathan bit into his loaf of bread. Then he laughed again. "Yes, I had a whole swarm after me, and Grim took an arrow in his hind end. But I got away, and a kind-hearted farmer hid both me and Grim in his barn, and that night he led me here to Marius. Now you know everything." "No, you don't know how everything at all," said Marius. "You don't know that people here in the valley sing songs about that ride and of Jonathan, that his coming here is the only happy thing that's happened in Wild Rose Valley since Tinjil invaded and made us slaves. Jonathan, our savior, they sing, because they believe he will liberate Wild Rose Valley, and I think so too. Now you know everything." "You don't know everything at all," said Jonathan. "You don't know that Marius is the leader of the secret rebellion in Wild Rose Valley. Now that Orvar is in Katla Cavern, they should call Marius the savior and not me." "No, I'm too old," said Marius. He was right. "Better if I live or die, it makes no difference." "You shouldn't say that," I said, "because you're my grandfather now." "Yes, well then, for that reason I'll need to stay alive, but I'm not able to lead the fight any longer. You should be young for that." He sighed. "If only Orvar were still here, but he'll sit in Katla Cavern until he's given to Katla." Then I saw that Jonathan's face had become pale. "Well, we'll see," he mumbled, "whom Katla gets in the end." But then he said, "Now we must get to work. You don't know either, Scotty, that here in this cottage we sleep during the day and work at night. Come, you'll see." He crawled in front of me through the shutter into the hideout, and there he showed me something. He threw aside the cushion that we had slept on and pulled up a pair of wide floorboards under it, which were loose. Then I saw a black hole going right down into the ground. "My underground passage begins here," said Jonathan. "And where is the end?" I asked, although I almost guessed what he would answer. "In the wild country on the other side of the wall," he said. "That's where it will end, once it's finished. Only a few more nights, then I think it'll be long enough." He crept down into the hole. "But I must dig a bit more," he said, "because, you see, I don't want to come up out of the dirt right under Big Doddick's nose." Then he disappeared, and I sat there for a while and waited. When he finally came back, he pushed a wooden pail filled with dirt in front of himself. He heaved it up to me, and I hauled it out through the shutter to Marius. "More dirt for my field," said Marius. "If I had a few peas and beans that I could sow and plant, there would be an end to the famine." "Well, do you really believe that?" said Jonathan. "Out of 10 beans from your field, Tinjil takes 9. Have you forgotten that?" "You're right," said Marius. "As long as Tinjil exists, there will be hunger and need in Wild Rose Valley." Now Marius was going to sneak out and empty the pail in his field, and I stood by the door and kept watch. "I should whistle," Jonathan said, "if I noticed the slightest thing that could be dangerous." I would whistle a special little melody that Jonathan had taught long ago, when we lived on Earth. We used to whistle together a lot at that time. In the evenings when we went to bed, I've probably always been able to whistle. Jonathan crawled back into his hole again to dig farther, and Marius closed the shutter and moved the sideboard. "Get it into your head, Scotty," he said. Never, never let Jonathan be inside without having the shutter closed and the sideboard in place in front of it. Get it into your head that you're in a land where Tinjil lives and rules. "I won't forget," I said. It was dark in the kitchen, only a single candle burned on the table, but Marius put it out. "The night must be dark in Wild Rose Valley," he said, "because there are so many eyes that want to see what you don't want them to see." Then he took the pail and disappeared, and I stood by the open door to keep watch. It was certainly dark, and like Marius wanted. The houses were dark, and the skies over Wild Rose Valley were dark. No stars were shining, and no moon. Everything was black, and I couldn't see anything at all. But all the eyes of the night that Marius talked about, they couldn't see anything either, I thought, and that was a comfort. It felt depressing and lonely to stand there waiting, and a little eerie too. Marius took so long, I became worried, more and more worried with every moment that went by. Why didn't he come back? I stared into the darkness, but surely it wasn't as dark. Suddenly I realized that it had become lighter. Or was it just that my eyes had gotten used to it? Then I noticed it. The moon was breaking out through the clouds. It was the worst thing that could happen, and I prayed to God that Marius would have time to get back, while there was still some darkness left to hide him. But then it was too late, because the moon was shining in its full brilliance now, and a river of moonlight flowed over the valley. In the light I saw Marius from a far distance. I saw him coming between the rose bushes with his pail. I looked around wildly. I should be keeping watch. And then I saw something else too. Doddick, big Doddick, with his back to me, came climbing down the wall on a rope ladder. It's hard to whistle when you're scared, so it didn't sound good, but I managed to get the melody out fair enough and quick as a lizard. Marius vanished behind the closest rose bush. By then Big Doddick was standing over me. "What are you whistling for?" he roared. Because I learned how to today," I stammered. "I couldn't whistle before, but just think, suddenly I can today. Do you want to listen?" I started again, but Doddick stopped me. "No, be quiet," he said. "I don't know if it's forbidden to whistle, but I think it is. I don't think Tingill approves of it. And anyway, your door should be closed, do you understand?" "Doesn't Tingill like it if your door is kept open?" I asked. "That's not your concern," said Doddick. "Do as I say, but give me a ladle of water first. I'm dying of thirst, walking up there on the wall." Then I thought quickly, if he followed me into the kitchen and didn't see Marius there, what would happen then? Poor Marius, the death penalty for those being out at night. I'd heard enough about that. "I'll get it," I said hastily. "Stay here and I'll get the water for you." I ran inside and I fumbled through the darkness toward the water barrel. I knew which corner it was in. I found the ladle too, and I filled it with water. Then I felt that someone was standing behind me. Yes, he was standing there in the darkness right behind my back, and I've never felt anything more creepy. "Light a candle," said Doddick. "I want to see what this rat trap looks like." My hands trembled, I trembled all over, but I still succeeded in lighting the candle. Doddick took the ladle and drank. He drank and drank as if he were a bottomless pit. Then he threw the ladle on the floor and looked around suspiciously with his cruel little eyes, and he asked exactly what I expected he would ask. "Where is old man Marius, who lives here? Where is he?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what I should say. "Didn't you hear what I asked you?" he said. "Where is Marius?" "He's sleeping," I said. I had to make something up. "Where?" said Doddick. "There's a little room next to the kitchen, and I knew Marius had his bed inside this room, but I also knew that he wasn't sleeping there now, so I pointed to the door and said, 'Inside there.' I whined so that it was scarcely heard. It sounded pitiful, and Doddick laughed scornfully at me. "You don't lie very well," he said. "Guess what we'll see next." He was so pleased he knew that I lied, and he wanted to arrange the death sentence for Marius and receive praise from Tingill. I knew it. "Give me the candle," he said, and I gave it to him. I wanted to rush away from there, just dash out through the door, and get Marius and tell him to flee before it was too late. But I couldn't move from my spot. I just stood there and felt sick. I was so scared. Doddick saw this, and he enjoyed it. He wasn't in a hurry, no. He smiled and dragged it out so that I would become even more scared. But when he was done smiling, he said, "Come now, my boy, now you'll show me where old man Marius is lying asleep." He kicked open the door to the room and showed me in so that I stumbled over the threshold. Then he pulled me up again and stood in front of me with the candle in his hand. "You liar, show me now," he said, and held up the candle to brighten the dark room. I didn't dare move or look up. I didn't want to be there. Oh, it was hopeless. But then amidst my misery I heard Marius's angry voice. "What are you staring at? can a person even sleep in peace at night? I looked up and saw Marius. Yes, he sat there in his bed, back in the darkest corner of the small room, peering at the light. He was only wearing a shirt, and his tousled hair looked as if he had been sleeping for a long time. In front of the open window, the pail stood next to the wall. Surely he was as quick as a lizard, the grandfather I had been given. But I almost felt sorry for Dodic. Never have I seen anyone look so utterly dumbstruck as he did, standing there glaring at Marius. I only came to get a little water, he said sullenly. Water, yes, that's the trick, said Marius. Don't you know that Tinjil has forbidden you to take water from us? He believes that will poison you. If you come and wake me one more time, then I'll do it too. I don't understand how he dared to say that to Dodic, but maybe it was the right thing to say to one of Tinjil's men, because Dodic just grunted a little and left for his wall. I had never seen a truly cruel person before I saw Tinjil of Carmagnaca. He came over the river of the ancient rivers in his golden sloop, and I stood there waiting with Marius. It was Jonathan who had sent me. He wanted me to see Tinjil, because then you'll understand better why folks here in the valley slave away and starve and die with only one thought and one dream, to see their valley free again. High up in the mountains of the ancient mountains, Tinjil had his cattle. He lived there. He only crossed the river occasionally to Wild Rose Valley, and he came to strike fear into the people, so that no one would forget who he was and begin to dream too much about freedom, said Jonathan. At first I hardly saw anything. So many of Tinjil's soldiers were standing there in front of me, many long rows to protect Tinjil while he was in Wild Rose Valley. He had good reason, I think, to be scared that an arrow might coming whistling out from an ambush. Tyrants are always scared, Jonathan had said, and Tinjil was the worst of all tyrants. Well, at first we saw almost nothing, neither Marius nor I, but then I found out what I could do. They stood there so self-assured and with their legs spread, Tinjil's soldiers. If I lay flat on my stomach behind the one with his legs spread the farthest, I could peek through his legs, but I couldn't get Marius to do it. The main thing is that you watch, he said, and that you never forget what you are seeing here today. As I watched, a big, beautiful, gilded ship approached us from the out on the river, with black-clad men at the oars. There were many oars, more than I could count, and the oars' blades glittered in the sun every time they rose up over the water. The rowers worked hard. Strong currents pulled at the ship. Maybe the pull was from the waterfall farther down the river, because I heard the thunder of mighty waters far away. That's Karma Falls you hear, said Marius, when I asked him. The song of Karma Falls, it's our lullaby here in Wild Rose Valley. As the children lie in bed and listen, they fall asleep. I thought about the children in Wild Rose Valley. Before, down here by the river bank, they had run and played and splashed in the water and had fun. Now they couldn't, because of the wall of hopelessness that enclosed everything. Along the whole wall there were only 2 gates, one that I had come through. It was called the main gate, and the other one here by the river, with the pier outside where Tinjil's sloop now lay moored. The gate was open at this moment for Tinjil, and through the archway, between a soldier's legs, I saw the pier and the black stallion that awaited Tinjil, so fine, with a saddle that glistened with gold and a bridle that glistened with gold. and I saw Tinjil step forward and swing himself up into the saddle and go riding through the gate. Suddenly he was quite close to me, so that I could see his cruel face and his cruel eyes. Cruel as a serpent, Jonathan had said, and so he looked, bloodthirsty and cruel through and through. The clothes that he wore were as red as blood, and the plumes in his helmet were red, as if he had dipped them in blood, and his eyes stared straight ahead. He didn't look at the people. It was as if there were nothing else in the world to him, nothing other than Tinjil of Carmagnaca. Yes, he was horrible. Everyone in Wild Rose Valley had been commanded to come to the village square. Tinjil would speak to them there. Marius and I went too, of course. It was such a tidy and pretty little square, with beautiful old houses surrounding it. Tinjil had them there now, all the people of Wild Rose Valley, except as he had ordered. They stood quietly and just waited, but oh, how you could feel their bitterness and sorrow. Here on the square it had been pleasant before. They had probably danced here and played and sang on summer evenings, or maybe they just sat on the bench outside the inn and talked with each other under the lindens. 2 old lindens grew there, and Tinjil had ridden up and taken his spot between them. He stayed on horseback and stared out over the square and the people, but he didn't see any of them. I'm sure of it. He had his advisor next to him, a conceited one named Bajuk. I found out from Marius. Bajuk had a white horse almost as nice as Tinjil's black one, and they sat there like 2 monarchs on their horses, just staring straight ahead. For a long time they sat like this. Around them the soldiers stood on guard, Tinjil's men in black helmets and black cloaks, and with their swords drawn. You could see they were sweating, because the sun was already high in the sky, and it was a warm day. "What do you think Tinjil will say?" I asked Marius. "That he is dissatisfied with us," says Marius. "He talks of nothing else." Tinjil didn't actually speak for himself. He would not talk to slaves. He only talked to Bajuk, and then Bajuk would announce how dissatisfied Tinjil was with the folks in Wild Rose Valley. They worked poorly and sheltered Tinjil's enemies. "Lionheart has not been found yet," said Bajuk. "Our gracious sovereign is dissatisfied by this." "Yes, I understand. I heard someone mumble right next to me. A poor wretch stood there, dressed in rags, a little old man with matted hair and a matted gray beard. "Our gracious sovereign's patience will soon be at its end," said Bajuk, "and he has come to punish Wild Rose Valley harshly and without mercy." "Yes, he's right, grumbled the old man next to me, and I realized that he must be a fool and out of his mind. But, said Bajuk, in his great goodness, our gracious sovereign will wait a while longer with his bloody punishment, and he has even offered a reward. 20 white horses go to the one who captures Lionheart for him." "Then I'll get the fox," said the old man, and he pushed me in the side. "I'll get 20 white horses then, from our gracious sovereign. Oh, that's good pay for such a little fox." I became so angry that I wanted to hit him. Even if he was a fool, he shouldn't talk so stupidly. "Have you no shame?" I whispered, and then he laughed. "No, not much," he said. Then he looked right into my face, and I saw his eyes. Only Jonathan had such beautiful shining eyes. It was true, he really had no shame. How could he come here, right in front of Tinjil's nose? Although no one recognized him, of course. Not even Marius did. Not until Jonathan clapped him on the back and said, "Old man, haven't we seen each other before?" Jonathan liked to dress himself up. He used to act out parts for me in the kitchen in the evenings, when we lived on Earth, I mean. He could be very creepy, and it was such fun. Sometimes I laughed so much that my stomach hurt. But now, here in front of Tinjil, it was almost too brazen. I must see what's happening too, he whispered. And now he wasn't laughing. There was nothing to laugh at either, because Tinjil had all the men of Wild Rose Valley stand in line in front of him, and with his cruel forefinger he pointed out those who would be taken across the river to Carmagnaca. I knew what that meant. Jonathan had told me. None of the ones whom Tinjil pointed to would come back alive. They would be slaves in Carmagnaca and drag stones up to the fortress Tinjil was having built on the highest mountain in the ancient mountains. It would be a fortress that could never be captured by an enemy, and Tinjil would sit there in all his cruelty year in and year out, finally feeling safe. But many slaves were needed to build such a fortress, and the slaves worked until they dropped. And then Katla gets them, Jonathan had said. When I remembered that, I shivered in the warmth of the sun. Katla was still just an awful name to me then, nothing more. It was quiet on the square when Tinjil pointed. Only a little bird sat high up in the tree above him, singing and trilling so beautifully. The bird probably didn't know what Tinjil was doing down there under the linden trees. But there was crying too. It was pitiful to hear them cry, all the women who would lose their men, and all the children who would never see their fathers again. Everyone cried. I did too. Tinjil, he didn't hear the crying. He sat on his horse and pointed, and the diamond on his forefinger flashed every time he ordered someone to death. It was terrible. He ordered folks to death with just his forefinger. But one of them he pointed to must have gone crazy when he heard his children crying, because suddenly he broke out of the line, and before the soldiers could stop him, he rushed toward Tinjil. "Tyrant," he shrieked, "one day you will die too. Have you thought of that?" And then he spat on Tinjil. Tinjil's expression didn't change. He just made a sign with his hand, and the soldier standing the closest raised his sword. I saw how it glittered in the sunshine, but at that same moment Jonathan grasped me by the neck and pressed me to his chest. He hid my face so that I saw nothing more, but I felt, or maybe I heard, the sobbing in Jonathan's chest, and when we went home he cried, something he used to never do. They mourned in Wild Rose Valley that day. Everyone mourned, everyone except Tinjil's soldiers. On the contrary, they were happy each time Tinjil came to Wild Rose Valley, because he threw a feast for his men. The poor man's blood had hardly dried, the one who was killed on the square, when a large keg of beer was brought out and pigs were roasted whole on the spit, so that the smell lay thick over Wild Rose Valley. And all of Tinjil's men ate and drank and bragged about Tinjil, who gave them so many good things. "But they take Wild Rose Valley's pigs, the thieves," said Marius, "and it's Wild Rose Valley's beer that they drink." Tinjil was not at the feast. When he was done pointing, he went back across the river, and now he is probably sitting contentedly in his castle and believes that he has struck terror into Wild Rose Valley, said Jonathan. When we got home, he probably thinks we are just frightened slaves and nothing else. But he's wrong, said Marius. What Tinjil doesn't understand is that he can never suppress people who fight for their freedom and stay together as we do. We went past a little house with apple trees around it, and Marius said, "That's where he lived, the one who was just killed." On the stone steps outside, a woman was sitting. I recognized her from the square. I remember how she screamed when Tinjil pointed to her man. Now she sat with scissors in her hand, busily cutting off her long fair hair. "What are you doing, Antonia?" asked Marius. "What will you do with your hair?" "Bowstrings," said Antonia. She didn't say anything more, but I shall never forget how her eyes looked when she said that. Many things brought the death penalty in Wild Rose Valley, Jonathan had said, but it was most risky to have weapons. It was forbidden more than anything else. Tinjil's soldiers went around searching in homes and farms, looking for hidden bows and arrows, and hidden swords and spears, but they never found anything. Yet there wasn't a single house or farm that didn't have weapons hidden, and weapons forged for the battle that must come in the end, said Jonathan. Tinjil had also promised white horses as a reward to those who exposed hidden weapons. How foolish, said Marius. Does he really think there is a single traitor in Wild Rose Valley? No, it's just Cherry Valley that has one, said Jonathan sadly. Well, I knew that it was Jonathan walking next to me, but it was hard to remember, with the way he looked in his beard and his rags. Jossie hasn't seen the atrocities and oppression we have seen, said Marius, or else he could never do what he is doing. I wonder what Sophia is doing, said Jonathan, and I really want to know if Bianca got there alive. We sincerely hope that she did, said Marius, and that Sophia has now put a stop to Jossie. When we arrived home at Marius's farm, we saw Big Doddick lying in the green grass and playing dice with 3 more of Tinjil's men. They had a day off, I think, because they laid there among the rose bushes the whole afternoon. We could see them from the kitchen window. They played dice and ate pork and drank beer that they had gotten at the square, several full pitchers. Gradually they stopped playing dice, then they ate pork and drank beer. Then they just drank beer. Then they did nothing. They just crawled around like beetles in the bushes. At last they fell asleep, all 4 of them. Their helmets and cloaks lay in the grass. They had thrown them off. No one could drink beer in a thick woolen cloak on such a warm day. But if Tinjil knew, he would have flogged, said Jonathan. Then he disappeared out through the door, and before I even had time to be scared, he was back with a cloak and a helmet. What do you have those awful things for? Asked Marius. I don't know yet, said Jonathan, but there may come a time when I need them. There may come a time when you'll slip up too, said Marius, but Jonathan ripped off his rags and his beard and put on his helmet and cloak, and he stood there looking exactly like one of Tinjil's men. It was terrible. Marius trembled and begged him for God's sake to hide those awful things inside the hideout, and Jonathan did. Then we lay down and slept the rest of the day. So that's why I don't know what happened when Big Doddick and his companions woke up and tried to figure out whose helmet and cloak were gone. Marius slept too, but he woke for a moment. He said afterward and heard shouting and cursing from out in the rose bushes. That night we worked farther on the underground passage. 3 more nights, no longer, said Jonathan. And what will happen then? I asked. What I've come here to do will happen, said Jonathan. Maybe it won't succeed, but I must try. To free Orvar. Not without me, I said. You won't leave without me again. Wherever you go, I'm going too. Then he looked at me for a long time, and then he smiled. All right, if you really want to, then that's also what I want, he said.